cognition techniques that I learned about in grad school, and then trying to integrate all this new knowledge about environmental health, which is not my content area. So I sort of, in a sense, poorly positioned to be a translator, but also in a sense really well positioned to be a translator of this information, because I think that, as Barbara kind of well set it up, translating a lot of really, really complicated and complex science that is not yet fully known. And so you have to sort of frame that information to people who might be out using it in the field with kids, and you have to do that carefully, I think. So I'm going to just sort of give you all a sort of overview of a lot of the different things that we've been doing with Community Translation Corps. We've heard a little bit about the results and the research part, and then I'll be focusing over here on the sort of the how of translation and the who. So these are just sort of the aims of the COTC, the Community Outreach Translation Corps of Michigan. Really aim one is about how do we do this? What's the best way to do this? And so we've been trying to have this, what I would say like a meta focus on what are we trying to do to the different groups or with the different groups that we're working with, and what are going to be the most effective ways to sort of get out different messages to different groups. And we're really looking to different audiences, so we're interfacing a lot of different audiences around these issues, all sort of connected to child health, but in very, very different ways and at very different levels. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the third thing, I guess they all say 1, 1, 1, so it's actually supposed to be 1, 2, 3. Is thinking again, like sort of with this idea about like carefully framing information, how sort of strong and direct of a message we can have based on the based on the science that we know currently. Because some of the groups we work with are more sort of advocacy organizations, and so we as a university need to be sort of careful about that. And yet it's an important sort of group of stakeholders to work with. So that comes up with it's very interesting discussions with our partners. So in terms of aim one, what are the sort of best practices? How do we work to translate this type of information? And use partnerships, build new partnerships, create networks, tap into the networks that exist. And so I think this conference is a fantastic opportunity and example of this. Just sort of getting more connected with existing networks and building new partnerships. And I think some of that is happening in poster sessions, and I'm sure as a result of this gathering will continue to happen, which is exciting. We also, and there's sort of a group of 3 of us that have been working together in the Community Translation Corps at Michigan, and we were sort of just brainstorming about like fun activities that could be good to bring people together. And one of the things we talked about was, these webinars come up, these different opportunities come up, and it would be kind of fun to host, joint viewings of them and sort of identify stakeholders around, even at the University of Michigan, which is, as here, very large. There's a lot of people doing a lot of different things. You don't know who might be interested, but once you get people in the room together, you get all the different perspectives that can be brought to bear on the question, and so it might spark some more sort of like interesting new conversations. That's another best practice potential. Another thing that I've been thinking about all day today is sort of faculty media training and sort of working with the people who are doing the science, which again is really complex, as we heard today. The methods are complex, the findings are nuanced, they change over time, different considerations need to be taken into account. And so how to sort of boil down these complex messages to a media level or to a community outreach level, I think is a huge challenge in all areas of science, but particularly something like this area, which is really difficult to sort of explain what we know in terms of causality versus just associations, all the complexities that have been coming up today. I think that's really important in terms of an outreach perspective and working with faculty who are deep in the science and sort of developing ways to connect that to sort of boiled down media message. Also, we've heard a lot about data in the last 2 talks. And one of the things we've been talking about in our group is the best ways to sort of coordinate all these streams of data and have student involvement in a really efficient and organized way. And so there's a lot of data floating around, everybody's interested in various pieces and sort of how to organize those sets of activities so that papers come out in a reasonable time frame for sort of student training, as well as sort of an organizational flow in terms of our understanding of science. So I'll say also a few words about outreach with that element cohort. And we've just been working with the team on various different strategies to kind of connect with the actual participants in the cohort. I think we're all very appreciative of the need for sort of longitudinal cohorts, maintaining cohort engagement so that they continue to give us this lovely data that they're so generous to give us, but sort of thinking about ways to keep the cohort engaged and really active in that area. And then this is just a broader way of connecting with other COTCs. So speaking more about the element cohort, we've been in talks with the element PIs and about strategies that they'd like to use to increase the engagement of the participants. So again, the longitudinal study is an observational cohort, so we're not sort of intervening with the cohort, but we're just trying to amp up their enthusiasm and engagement and continued participation in the data collection. And so we can, Karen has been involved in a lot of these conversations, but there are various things that are different in terms of a cohort in Mexico versus in the US in terms of sort of incentives. These people are coming and giving their blood and their urine and other samples and doing a lot of testing, and they're not getting paid like they would in the US population. So there have been some interesting conversations around that. So just sort of want to understand cultural differences in terms of research participation. So one thing that we've talked about is like increasing the incentives for the participants in the element cohort. And if I were doing this research here, they'd be paid a lot more than $30, but this was sort of a big discussion. And there's things like the mail doesn't work well, so they can't send out reminder postcards, which is kind of what we do in my longitudinal research with US participants. So this has been a really interesting, like again, set of discussions. The element staff are really, really dedicated and very invested in their project. And they're also really interested in kind of providing a lot of training and ongoing support to the research staff, who are the frontline people who the participants know and engage with. So that, I like that because it's so, so important, because those frontline people are the ones who the participants know. They don't know often the sort of PIs really behind the project, but they know the person who calls them on the phone and asks them to come in for the next assessment. So supporting those kind of frontline staff is really important to talk about that. Also about sharing results. Again, this is not sharing individual results, but just sort of through newsletters and this kind of thing. We've been working with the Element group to develop a newsletter, and of course it's going to be in Spanish, and so we've gone back and forth with what to include in that. And again, just because this is again an observational study, we don't want to drastically change their behavior, but we want to balance sort of what we're sharing with I don't think everybody's going to go and make dramatic change that will have dramatic biological change, but we just want to be careful about sort of what we're sharing in terms of biasing perceptions. Okay, I mean, if only behavior change were that easy. It's not actually something I'm functionally worried about, but it's just thinking that through. Okay, so in terms of other outreach strategies, sort of COTC-wide, we're also trying to work to establish more of a social media presence, so that'd be a great thing to connect on further. I sort of professionally tweeted a little bit over the past few years, and it's pretty fun, but I just sort of think about tweeting out a range of things that I think are important, but we wanted to have a real identity so that it's not coming from at Alison Miller PhD, but it's coming from at UMC PhD. So that's starting up. But I think what I do, I don't know how many people tweet professionally, but it's really interesting because you kind of have to think about, I read something and I think, oh, I think that's important, I'm going to tweet it. And then I have to sort of always double check, should I professionally tweet it? And so thinking about kind of what the message is, again, because of the complexity and the nuance and the lack of causal evidence we have, a lot of these data, it's important what message we send out, and we have to be kind of careful about that. So if it has a stamp of the University of Michigan or University of Illinois on there, we have to sort of be cognizant of how confident we are in that information. I always tweet things like, poverty is bad for kids. I'm very confident in that information. But short of that, there's some other, Head Start is good, so things like that. And I think the other thing, and just working with clinicians and practitioners, YouTube, there's so many different social media platforms out there, and they're so heavily used for everything that if you're not there, you're really missing the boat. So, just plug for social media. And of course, we have developed a website. It took longer than we'd like, but it's there. And so we're really, it's a pretty standard website, but we're going to try to enhance it in various ways, and a lot of our outreach efforts are featured on the website.
So you need to update your literature course.
Update literature?
Publication.
Oh, yeah. Then that should be done. And I will communicate with people who need to do that. But yeah, that's the thing. I mean, and frankly, as a sidebar, website thing, it's always great and appealing, and you get it, you feel like this great sense of accomplishment, but then yeah, I mean, even my personal lab website, I look at it and I'm like, oh, we need to update that literature, and it's so static. And I think the difference between that and more of an active social media presence is huge. And I think websites are very sort of passé. They're necessary, but they're just sort of not sufficient, I guess is the answer. So I absolutely agree. Unless you have somebody who's really passionately engaged with the website and is really on there and tweeting from it and doing all these other things. So on the phone calls for the CO2Ps, that's kind of a theme as well. The other thing that we have done a fair bit of is working with a collaborative group of agencies representing lots of different interests in Michigan. It's actually in Grand Rapids, Michigan, so it's about 2 hours away from Ann Arbor. So some of it we do by phone, some of it we do in person. In the winter months, we do it by phone. Because I'm from California and I do not like to drive extensive distances. But the other day we had, we kind of come to the end of this sort of big project, and I'll show some information from that. But we had this sort of visioning meeting together, and it was really fascinating because a lot of just really great people were in the room, new faces, some of these like advocacy groups around clean air and clean water and green building, and lots of just different sort of stakeholders were in the room, and it just led to a fascinating set of conversations around what's our vision and what do we think is important and what does this mean. And we talked about healthy environments for all children. Did that put more of a focus on health equity issues? Healthy environments, healthy children, is it only children? So we just had these sort of deep conversations and said, okay, well, healthy environments, healthy children feels like it's encompassing and broad and actually sort of focused on what we're all interested in. So that's an ongoing process, and I think it's a really great group to work with. One of the things I was actually talking with Barbara and Brett about break was we're working with a particular group, the Healthy Homes Coalition, and they're very interested in sort of lead abatement and housing quality and housing stock. And they're working with Head Start, which is a preschool program for low-income children, federally funded. And they're really interested in sort of training the teachers who are the frontline providers around environmental health, and also getting the teachers to work with the parents of the children. So in Head Start, you, as a part of the program, is that the teachers are required to do a home visit at the beginning of the year, and then again at the end of the year to sort of check in on child progress and families and literally see where the child is coming from, which is, I think, a great part of the Head Start program. But the teachers aren't necessarily trained in sort of what to look for in terms of environmental health hazards and this kind of thing. So what we're starting to do, we're starting to work on, and we'll connect further about it, is working on sort of materials that the teachers can use while they're in the children's homes to just sort of do like a brief screener and talk to the parents a little bit about environmental health concerns, because it's really not something that they do, but they're there from home, so it could be a really great opportunity. What else? Oh, and of course, many members of our audience and team have been involved in webinars, I think a lot. So that's a form of our outreach as well. So this is the website, familiar photo. Again, I'll just flash through it. This is the community outreach page. So we'll need to update it as things happen. But all of the things I'm kind of describing are basically represented on the website. This is, I think, the slightly more interesting example. So this is a project that we kind of had been working on with the community group in Grand Rapids. These were sort of all the stakeholders. This group down here. So this is the Healthy Homes Coalition. There's a large interest in asthma and air quality in this group. We're working with the Head Start agency, the health department as well. And basically what this group was interested in was looking at what does asthma look like in children in their community. So this is a map of Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I'm not from Grand Rapids, but everybody that we're working with is mostly from Grand Rapids. And so they look at this map and they're like, oh, I see, like for example, up here, these little red dots are children with asthma who are in Head Start. These are Head Start data, so they're 3 to 5-year-old children. And this is like a little, it's a housing complex that's sort of known to have sort of substandard housing quality. And so everybody who was involved in this community looked at that and went, that's, this place, and that's sort of pointing out that, asthma is sort of bubbling up and more common in this particular set of housing units. The other thing that's I think interesting about this map is that the things that are marked on here are these sort of major roadways and thoroughfares, and there's one particular very, very dynamic woman in the group who does air quality, and she was telling a story just the other day about an incinerator that I actually forget where on the map it was, but everybody knew where it was, and basically it's set up, it's very near to downtown, but it's set up so that if you're coming from the low income, if you're like in the low income area of town, which is very demarcated in Grand Rapids, it's really obvious, and it's a big sort of silhouette in the skyline all the time, but if you're coming from the wealthier area of town, and there's actually literally a street called Wealthy Street that sort of is the demarcating the line, the dividing line. It's sort of shielded by a set of other buildings, and you can't see it. So it's almost like these buildings kind of hide the big incinerator that's downtown. That's very, and with the person I'm talking about here, she's just very passionate, and she had actually invited some advocates from another air quality group, and we were just having this big discussion about what do we do? What do we do about this? How do we present this information? What can we say about this? So that sort of type of story, coupled with data and visual data like the maps, I think can be a pretty powerful way of getting the message across. And sort of leading into that, advancing policy was another aim. And we're basically at the point where we're sort of preparing to do that. I wouldn't say we're near to doing that, but we were talking about sort of preparing the soil for when we are ready to do that. So when we have PSAs that we want to share, whatever it is, who are going to be the audience and the big picture kind of policy level stakeholders for that. And again, I think always back to the readying the faculty to be like, okay, if you had to say 3 bullet points about your research that you could stand behind and be on NPR or be on TV or go viral on YouTube about, what would they be? So that's sort of intense to think about. I don't know what I would say, except for poverty is bad for kids. And I think that an obvious way also to do that is to partner with existing national networks. The other thing we are doing with the asthma maps is that we have a nurse practitioner who's involved with the group, and she has a bunch of sort of case study vignettes, success stories, horror stories, and so she's developing those to sort of share in conjunction with the maps. And the other person, the air quality person I was talking about, has also developed an asthma presentation that members of the group are kind of going to their different constituencies basically and presenting parts of, and that's one of the things we talked a lot about is how we've developed all these maps together, but sort of how do we share them to different audiences, and depending on who your audience is, what are you going to highlight about the maps? And so the way that she has pulled in a lot of these images I thought was just great and powerful, and these are all images, I think most of them are in Grand Rapids. I don't know where this is in particular, but she, again, is just very passionate about sort of making it Grand Rapids, illustrative of Grand Rapids. And so these are some of the slides she put together that I just want to show you guys. And this is the same map, it's got different overlays. So there's an overlay by, you know, race, ethnicity. There's an overlay by income level, education level. Basically the kind of data that Head Start had that we could link to the asthma rates. And so they sort of appear in her presentation with these sort of large statements, which, you know, as sort of an academic researcher, it feels like, oh wow, that's a really broad statement. Can we really say that? Are we backing it up with our references and everything? But coming from the sort of more advocacy perspective, it's really different. And sort of coming to a place where you're both comfortable is an interesting and I think really important process. And this is again sort of another way that she would present those kind of data and just highlight. And I work with a lot of low-income children and families, and one thing we did do was go around and take pictures of neighborhoods and roads and places where these families live. And I think if you're not in that world of working with the kids and families all the time and just sort of, and it's all numbers, it's nice to kind of get to the visual images sometimes and kind of remember like, oh yeah, this is what a house looks like that a 3-year-old is living in, for example. That's all I've got for right now. These are the two people. Lindsay Mitchell is the Associate Director of the COTC, and then Megan Moynihan in particular is a PhD student